top stories, expert dubs U.S. measures against Ethiopia unhelpful. And Mali suspended from African Union membership. Hello and many thanks for joining us. You're watching Addis News Hour. With the news, I'm Tabitha John. Do stay with us. Spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Dina Mufti, said Ethiopia will always strive for mutual benefit. In his weekly press briefing to journalists, Dina stressed his strong objection towards the sanctions currently imposed by the U.S. government. Kazaun Chani reports.
Briefing journalists on Carbon Issue, spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Dina Mufti, said Ethiopia is always committed to bolster ties with its partners that consider mutual benefit.
On the current situations prevailing between Ethiopia and the U.S., as you know, Ethiopia treasures its relationship with the U.S. and believes that sanctions are not necessary for the U.S. to send its message across the country, especially at this particular time when Ethiopians are preparing to exercise their democratic right by going to the polls. Well, as you know, the Ethiopian government had been addressing major issues that had been raised by the other side, and it will continue addressing those issues right now. The humanitarian situation is fundamentally Ethiopia's concern. It's Ethiopia that has to deal with its internal affairs, and what is expected of others is actually to support Ethiopia so as to strongly deal with the situations. This is what we expect from our friendly countries like the United States. It's not in our interest to escalate this tension.
The spokesperson also said that Ethiopia wants to strengthen strong relations with the United States government in accordance with its foreign policy, and there is no limit to friendship, he added.
It's in the interest of Ethiopia. It's not only in the interest of Ethiopia, it's the interest of the United States, its people, and the region as well, to maintain friendly relations between the two countries. This is a relationship that has been there for the last 120 years. It has been robust. It has contributed to the regional peace and stability. And that is how we would like to maintain that relationship. Having said this briefly, I want to say what has been happening on economic diplomatic front.
Furthermore, the spokesperson approves Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's remark to build 100 dams in the coming year is a natural right of Ethiopia.
U.S. interference in the internal affairs of Ethiopia is not only problematic but also illogical in the same way as it would not allow Ethiopia to interfere in its affairs. Thus, Ethiopians' angry and vocal denouncement of such sovereignty infringement is obvious. International affairs expert Simo-Pekka Parvianian made the remarks. Western relationship with Ethiopia should rather be on the principle of no harm, and resorting to any arm twisting cannot be beneficial, he said. Shifarau Lako reports.
Ethiopians generally have a positive attitude toward the U.S. and Western nations in general. International affairs expert Simo-Pekka Parvianian tells ETV. In fact, he says the Ethiopian diaspora in the USA was instrumental in voting for the Biden administration. However, U.S. latest measures at the expense of this are not only unexpected, but also tantamount to infringement of national sovereignty. Therefore, Ethiopians' anger and disappointment are obvious.
This interference, like saying that you have to withdraw from certain area from your own country, you have to do something inside your territory, in the sovereignty, inside the sovereignty, I find it very problematic that if you make the same example that Ethiopia would say that the democracy in US is not not very workable, and the election of Trump, for example, was a demonstration of not a democratic way, or this. You can make this argument in any country, and it will not produce any kind of good results. So I think it's an understandable reaction, and also I think the highlights also the kind of surprise from the Ethiopian people that there's very positive attitudes towards the West in general. And
he also says such measures are surprising as they come against a long-time and close ally, Ethiopia.
This sanctions addition is quite dramatic, taking into consideration that the long-standing, decades-long partnership between US and Ethiopia. So this is kind of very rapid policy change, which is kind of in many ways very surprising. And what I find very key in this sanction is the wording that multilateral institutions like World Bank, IMF, the Bretton Woods institutions, and other multilateral finance institutions that international community is part of.
He says Western relationship with Ethiopia should rather be on the principle of no harm, and resorting to any arm twisting is not beneficial.
And I want to say also, when it comes to the West, that our engagement has been very much development driven for decades. And if we depart from that and we start using development aid in some sort of like a pressure instrument, it doesn't work. My argument has been, like I argue in my article, is the do no harm principle in development cooperation, that you have certain positive trends which you can help, and there you can offer assistance, but withholding aid and using aid as a pressure, it's rarely working, and I would really caution using that kind of tools. That when there is a positive developments in the country, then the development partners can come, they can support, but this kind of using pressure and especially pushing pushing the pause button in a projects that absolutely have been used and developed very carefully, and then suddenly pushing the pause button, it's not good way of doing development cooperation, because you have to have a kind of strategic long-term view.
He has also called on the USA to reconsider the restriction and impositions that they may have a lasting consequence on Ethiopia, especially those that have low incomes.
Ethiopian American Civic Council expressed deepest gratitude to Senator Jim Inhofe for opposing the heavy-handed Biden administration's visa restrictions on Ethiopia. Quote unquote, the Honorable Senator Inhofe, Ethiopia salutes you for your courageous stance to tell the truth to the world. Your historic speech echoes Emperor Haile Selassie's call in 1936, reminding the League of Nations that 12 million Ethiopians were rendered without modern weapons to defend themselves, by warning the world body that God and history will remember your judgment, said the statement. The council expressed hope that the administration will heed Jim Inhofe's call to refrain from escalating the diplomatic posture that may threaten the century-long U.S. bilateral relationship with Ethiopia, a consequential African nation. Africa should work aggressively in building democracy to assure its independence. This remark came from Mesfin Hailu, who has been working to promote democracy all over the state in the U.S. In his exclusive interview with ETV English, Mesfin stressed the U.S. should promote and support Ethiopia's effort to prevail democracy in the country. Mesfin also highlighted Ethiopia and Ethiopians don't need any intervention to resolve their own internal affairs. Jerusalem Betha report.
The recent U.S. visa restriction imposed over Ethiopian officials by the U.S. comes from supposed concern about the escalating violence and the hardening of regional and ethnic divisions in Ethiopia. However, Mesfin Hailu, who has been working to promote democracy for many years in the U.S., says the EU and the U.S. need TPLF back in power in order to have a puppet government in Ethiopia so that they can twist its arm as they wish.
EU and US government, all of them like to keep TPLF in power because they would do anything for money. They send army all over Africa. Ethiopia has never fought a fight outside the Ethiopian boundaries until TPLF came to power. And Ethiopia has always resisted outside interference, and heroic people fought for their power, for their integrity. But now, that's why they want to keep TPLF, but it's too late. They don't realize how late it is. There is no way that Ethiopia will go back.
As Ethiopia and the U.S. have long-standing diplomatic relations and the U.S. has given priority for democracy, Mesfin expects support for Ethiopia rather than obstacle, reminding the 1948 U.S. Marshall Plan to promote democracy in Western Europe.
Western Europe is a developed democracy and became a really good ally with the US. And why not for Africa, for Ethiopia? Why do they want us to be begging for wheat or food all the time? We want to be self-sufficient, we want to be strong in our own, and US should support democracy in our country, Ethiopia.
Historically, Ethiopians know diplomacy and what and how to do to solve their internal matters without any need of external power, Mesfin said.
No one should undermine Ethiopia, and it's an inspiration for black nations, as I say. So no matter what happens, we'll prevail, because as long as we are united, we'll have solutions and we'll go forward. And the only thing I ask the US government is not to use our taxpayer money to repress democracy. We don't want any ethnic factions in Ethiopia. We don't want Bantustan nation in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is one nation, and it has to remain like that, and democracy should be supported, not undermined. Interference by itself is undemocratic. You don't interfere on internal affairs of any nation, let alone Ethiopia, which has a statehood for over 3,000 years. Ethiopia's, we Ethiopians are very proud people, and no, we don't want anybody to interfere and tell us how to do our internal matters.
Mesfin stressed as Africans, in particular Ethiopians, had made a history to realize their freedom through a Pan-Africanism movement. Africans should unite and be independent of any power for the prevalence of democracy on the continent.
That time Pan-Africanism was promoted, and I think we are very far from that right now. I don't want to see that kind of communism over imperial and the capitalism kind of fight in Ethiopia. We don't want that. But there will be no choice left for Ethiopia if US continue to push this. That's how I feel. The only way we can assure our independence is by forging what we started, establish democracy, so we don't have to we don't want to be depending on any other donor nations. We want to be self-sufficient.
Mesfin and his friends have been trying to be voice for Ethiopians at the U.S. Embassy in Ethiopia on Tuesday. According to Mesfin, they have requested the U.S. in letter to stop its intervention in Ethiopia's internal matter and to support democracy in Ethiopia.
የፓርኩ ከፍተኛ ቦታ ዶዶ ተራራ የሚባል ቦታ አለ። እሱ ነው የፓርኩ ከፍታ ቦታ።
ከሌላው በጣም የተለየ ቦታ ነው። አካባቢውም በጣም ቀዝቀዝ ያለ ቦታ ነው። እንደገናም ደግሞ ያሉት ሪሶርሶች በበቂ ሁኔታ የሚታዩበት የዶዶ ጋራን በፊት ለፊቱ የሚታይ ዋናው የቱሪስት መስህብ ተብሎ የሚጠራው በፊት ለፊቱ የሚታይ ቦታ ነውና
Welcome back. Arabic lecturer at Addis Ababa University, Umar Makonnen, said Ethiopia has an assignment to counter the Egyptians' unverifiable diplomatic activities, which are based on false narratives. Umar underscored the need to bolster ties with African countries to deal with African issues like the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Emmanuel Jorgi has more on this.
Following the continuation of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam construction, Egyptian politicians, activists and journalists are striving to advocate their unjust stance on the utilization of the Nile water, which 86% volume of its water comes from Ethiopia. Omar Makonnen is a lecturer at Addis Ababa University and well known for monitoring Egyptian media outputs and giving analysis. He suggested the need to invest more in the diplomatic arena to counter the Egyptian unpredictable stance, false narratives, and take the upper hand in the GERD diplomacy. He says to accomplish the second feeling is to ease external pressures.
The intensification of foreign pressures has come in relation with the second filling of the dam. It is because after the completion of the Renaissance Dam, it will be a new history. Afterward, no one will dare to touch it. This means the dam will be self-protective. When Ethiopia completes the construction of the dam and starts generating electricity, it will surely create a better linkage with African nations and make Ethiopia influential. My suggestion here is the Ethiopian embassy should work hard in lobbying the Western world through influential Ethiopians in different countries.
Noting effectiveness of Ethiopian stance, Omar underscored that Ethiopia should keep going on the principle of African solution for African problems, especially by cooperating with the rest of African nations.
Egyptians are doing their best to pretend as if the GERD issue is international, religious and so on. But due to efforts made by Ethiopian government, African nations never accepted those false narratives. So currently, Ethiopia is getting the diplomatic victory at hand. This is what we have to strengthen and continue. Even now, on how to resist the pressures from the Western world, we have to stand together with all our brother African nations.
The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is above 80% performance, is scheduled for the second round reservoir filling in the coming rainy season.
The National Electoral Board of Ethiopia is undertaking preparations to hold the upcoming 6th general election across the country, despite some problems in the process. Talking to ETV, opposition political parties reaffirmed commitment to maximize efforts in building democratic culture in Ethiopia. Haptam Washagri has more.
After frequent suspensions, Ethiopia is finalizing preparations for the upcoming 6th general election across the country. Talking to TV, contesting political parties said they are undertaking election activities regardless of challenges they remarked on the election process. They also articulated violations of election proclamations during election processes by some executives.
There are a number of problems or challenges that we have encountered. Now, regarding the campaign, for instance, now the security forces wouldn't allow us to make campaign as we need. Regarding campaign, we do have a number of problems. Our political leaders are in jail. That is still another problem. Or we are facing or encountering a number of problems. But despite the fact that we do have those problems, we are trying to do our best.
We have passed through so many challenges to arrive at this point. First of all, in candidate registration, we have faced a number of challenges on the ground that at candidate registration stations, we were not able to register our candidates as we wish to register them.
According to the politicians, the National Election Board of Ethiopia has been trying to solve some problems related with the election process, but each and every problem has not been addressed yet.
We had to communicate this challenge with the National Election Board of Ethiopia, and it's only with consultation with the neighbors that we have been able to register all our candidates. Having passed through that, we had to pass through the election campaign and the voter registration. The voter registration was made with too many irregularities. We have seen that, and that was acknowledged by the National Election Board of Ethiopia as well. There were too many delays in opening of the registering stations.
I think the board is trying its best, but each and every problem cannot be solved at all. Now, for instance, registration date, we are asking the National Election Board to extend or to give some days for voter registrations, but the office refused to do so. But for each and every type of problems that we are having, we reported, or we give a report, or we wrote letters to the National Election Board, but responses may not be given at all. The chairperson might be fed up of giving every response for every problem that opposition parties are having, because we don't have any system at all. Having an individual who is extremely impartial as chairpersons of the National Election Board might not mean that all problems would be solved, because we don't have such type of system at all.
Despite many challenges witnessing in Ethiopia, the National Election Board of Ethiopia is striving to make the upcoming election to be democratic. In an exclusive interview with the TV, Ethiopian Human Rights Commissioner Daniel Bekele to his part called on all political parties as well as other institutions to implement human rights minimum agendas to undertake free, fair and credible election.
The central message from us is for all political parties, all contending political parties, which includes the ruling party, to demonstrate commitment for the 6-point human rights agenda at a minimum. That is a minimum human rights agenda. We are not saying that all of Ethiopia's human rights issues could be resolved by a 6-point agenda. But at a minimum, we expect all contending parties, including the ruling party and other stakeholders, which includes law enforcement agencies and media, to demonstrate commitment for the 6-point human rights agenda.
Information obtained from the National Election Board of Ethiopia shows Ethiopian political parties will conduct their election campaign until June 16, 2021. No election campaign will be conducted as of June 17 until the exact day of election.
Recently, Kello Media has disseminated fake news, taking Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's parliamentary session voice from last November to his discussion with the executives in May this year. This is done to undermine the reputation of the premier, making the leader appear to say or do things that are never actually occurred, according to the office of the Prime Minister. Ethiopians are raising concerns about the media as the alleged leaked video of the Prime Minister is proved to be entirely false. Daniel Kasahun has more.
Fake news is a powerful entity for those who do its production and dissemination to disrupt political order and influence major issues like an election. The one we found in Kello Media's transmission of fake news is composed from Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's parliamentary session voice from last November to a discussion with the executives in this May, which is unethical and disruptive. The video content published by Kelo Media, which is said to be based in Egypt, is entirely false and based on doctoring Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's past speech. It's designed to undermine the reputation of the premier, making the leader appear to say or do things that never actually occurred. In the 2-minute leaked video, the Prime Minister is heard making remarks about the upcoming Ethiopian elections, saying, "I would rather die than hand over power." The information being disseminated is completely false. It was manufactured from the party's president's speech at different times. A media that fails to do fact-checking does not deserve to be called media. There were media outlets that published the video, like Ethiopian, but later they announced saying that they are taking the content down until the content was verified.
Cuban ambassador to Ethiopia says U.S. government 60-year heavy sanctions against Cuba had nothing to do with human rights or democracy. The ambassador, Vilma Thomas, says the only purpose of the U.S. government was to impoverish the Cuban people and overthrow their government. Drawing parallel lines to the recent case in Ethiopia and other nations, she advised sanctioned countries to unite and voice against such unilateral sanctions. Sintayo Tamrat interviewed the ambassador and dispatched the following report.
In an exclusive interview with ETV English, Cuban ambassador to Ethiopia Vilma Thomas explained how unjust and irrational has been the over 60-year-long and heavy sanction by the U.S. government against their country. She says Cuba is the best example of countries hit by the U.S. sanction.
It is the most unfair and long regime of unilateral sanction imposed ever against any country, the one imposed on Cuba, and has had a very huge impact, economic and human impact on Cuba over 60 years. 7 out of 10 Cubans have lived all their life under the sanctions imposed by the blockade. The blockade impacts our life, our family life. It means Cuba have not access to medicines that needs for the treatment of the population. We have not access to spare parts we need for the running of our machines, of our transport.
U.S. government's 60-year heavy sanctions against Cuba have nothing to do with human rights and democracy. If humanity is at the heart of the sanctions, they can at least have eased the sanctions during the COVID-19 pandemic.
First of all, let me tell you, all countries in the world, all of us, we have challenges in the matter of human rights. There is no country in the world, not even the U.S., let me start by this, that can say that they have all the human rights are protected in general and that they have fulfilled all the conditions to have the promotion and protection of the human rights 100%. Human rights is used as a pretense. If you really are interested in human rights in other countries, the best way, is just to try to find ways of cooperate. And if there is any issue, there are international organizations that are the proper forum to deal with the situation.
However, the only purpose of the U.S. government is to impoverish the Cuban people and overthrow their government, she stated, substantiating her words with a 1960 memorandum by Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Lester Mallory. The majority of Cubans support Castro, and there is no effective political opposition, she reads.
Every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba, denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government. When you mention the purpose, this is the purpose. They are even acknowledging that the majority of Cuban population support the government. And despite that, they are saying that they will work to create disenchantment, hunger, and deprivation instead of the people wanting to overthrow the government.
Sanctioned countries shall unite and voice against such unilateral sanctions, she advised.
You have to unite yourself. You have the African Union. You have strong organizations. You are also, there are 54 African countries. You are a strong voice at the international organizations. You have many votes at the UN. Africa united is a strong force at any international organizations. But Africa united. If you let yourself to be divided, it is difficult to achieve anything.